Hello and welcome. I'm Mark Applebaum, and I've been teaching qualitative research in psychology for more than 15 years. This is part of a series introducing phenomenological research in the human sciences, and in particular, existential phenomenological research is what I'm going to be speaking to in the series. This episode is about pitfalls in the interviewing process, and it's mostly aimed at students who are just at the very beginning of learning how to do qualitative interviewing. And the book I'm relying on in terms of a guide here for my work with students is Scott Churchill's excellent text, Essentials of Existential Phenomenological Research. So it's a book that I can't recommend highly enough because it is so user-friendly and provides great examples from student work, as well as an excellent introduction to the epistemology underlying phenomenological work. So, what do I mean by pitfalls in the interviewing process? First of all, one theme you're going to hear a lot from me in this short presentation is that learning to do phenomenological interviewing is a real alteration in the way that most people will be familiar in listening to others and in conversing with others. Because as I've written about for publication, the interview itself is an experience, and but it's different from everyday experience in the world. So there's a shift of consciousness involved in learning to be a good interviewer, in my opinion. And these pitfalls are basically my attempt to provide students with guidelines, but the process of learning to become a good interviewer is trial and error, like any craft. So these are not big failures, but they're traps to avoid as you begin to interview. So, first of all, having an overly broad question that doesn't invite description can really be an issue for students who are learning to use this method. And that's because we want a concrete description of a specific event rather than a lot of generalizations that could stay at a high level, right? Um, A second pitfall, and we'll talk about each of these in more detail, would be not screening participants in advance and instead surprising the person who has volunteered with an interview question that they weren't familiar with already. Now, this would only apply to gathering practice data, not actual psychological research, right? Because in doing full-fledged research, there would have been a whole process of getting permissions, writing a proposal. The whole process of screening participants would be quite methodical. So I'm not speaking about that as much as just practice data. Falling into an everyday conversational attitude is something that can often happen to students who are learning how to interview for the first time. And that is, as we will talk about, part of the process of learning what a research attitude is compared to the attitude of everyday life, or indeed to the clinical attitude that many of my students may have if they're already trained in psychology as clinicians. Likewise, and particularly for that last group that I mentioned, there may be, depending on people's training, a struggle to frame the interview, to understand the interview as data collection, data gathering, instead of an opportunity to validate the other person's experience. So the difference between empathic listening, which is what we're doing in a phenomenological interview, um, versus an intervention or a active validation is really sometimes subtle for clinicians, and we'll talk a bit about that later. And finally, having what Scott in the book that I referred to refers to as an access question, meaning the prompt, the basic interview question, that is, if that question is unclear to the person you're interviewing, for example, if it's not in everyday language, and so therefore it needs to be explained to the person, then there's already something off. There's already a problem with the way that that prompt has been developed by the student. So we'll discuss all these next in a bit more detail. So using an overly broad question in a phenomenological interview. So concreteness is really a priority because in this method, we're looking for as concrete and detailed and specific a description of just what an experience was like for the other person as we can possibly get. So what we're not looking for is a series of generalizations or a life history where the person is trying to, in a very generalizing way, weave together many experiences through the course of their life. Instead, we're focusing in on a particular memorable or important event. And so what you will find if instead you get kind of a high level summary of people's experiences in an interview is that generalizations are just not as psychologically revelatory as a detailed description because we are not getting the real qualia. In other words, the real, like, what was it like for you to live that experience, which is what we're looking for. It's also true that if the person you're interviewing hears your question as overly broad, they're likely to try to speculate and theorize in order to come up with a good answer to that broad question. So, to give you an example off the top of my head, one example would be the difference between asking, tell me about what it's like to be a father versus tell me about a time when you became a parent or became a father, right? So the second one is much more geared toward an event in the person's life, whereas the first seeks a generalizing answer and is going to prompt the person into a highly reflective whole series of thoughts about their life as a whole and becoming a parent and what was that? What can I tell this interviewer in an overarching summary way about all of those meanings? And they're both good questions, right? There's nothing wrong in principle with either question. However, in this method, what we're looking for is not a lot of generalizations, nor are we aiming for the life lessons that someone has gleaned about their experience. We're really trying to get into the nitty gritty of a particular experience just the way it is present for them in the here and now. So that's the rule of thumb. So another pitfall would be having a vague access question, meaning the way that the interview prompt is worded is vague. What do I mean? I mean, that question needs to be in everyday language that's easily grasped. It needs to be easily understood. It needs to have a relationship to that person's life so that it's immediately clear to them what you're asking. Uh, and that means that your interview prompt must be in language that lines up. It doesn't require a lot of deliberation, reflection. Let me really think about what you're asking. All of that, again, it's not bad, but that puts the person in a completely different attitude psychologically than what you're looking for in this method, which is to go straight to an experience that's important and memorable. And the caveat I would put here is you may be researching a phenomenon, probably not as a student, but when you get deeper into a dissertation or if you're a postgrad, you may be researching a phenomenon that wouldn't be widely understood in your society, but there's a subgroup for whom it's very easily recognizable, right? And so, just to give you an example from my own research, you might be investigating, as I did, for example, an experience in meditative practice. So you could ask a question that experienced meditators would be immediately familiar with. Um, have you had an experience, let's say, in deep meditation when time seemed to stop or drop off entirely, the passage of time? So now that might or might not be a recognizable phenomenon to anybody else outside of the context of meditation. The point is, within the community of people that you are interviewing, it's meaningful. So this everyday language could be everyday language for that community of people. If you find, on the other hand, as a practice interviewer, that you need to spend a lot of time explaining what your question means to the other person, then that's a sign that the question is not yet well enough developed, or that it doesn't fit the person sitting in front of you. That if all that explanation is required, they're not a good participant for the question itself, or you may need to go back to the drawing board and come up with a better question. And this sort of brings us to not screening properly in terms of the participant that you chose. Um, so the way that we would typically talk about this in descriptive phenomenology is that we want people for whom the meaning of that phenomenon is already there for them. They've already had an experience of time stopping, for example, if they're a meditator, seeming to stop. Or even more concretely, they are already a parent, and you're interviewing them about the event in which they became so, right? So if that's not there, then you haven't done your job in terms of actually finding someone who's appropriate for your study before you start to interview. Now, again, obviously, this is more a scenario that would happen not in a full-fledged psychological study that had gone through the proposal and ethics review process already. This is just, we're talking about not a full-fledged study, but practice data in which students are just soliciting everyday descriptions of phenomena that are not psychologically sensitive. Okay. So we have not gone through that full process of approval because we're not looking at psychologically sensitive phenomena. Instead, we're looking at more everyday phenomena. But nevertheless, you need to make sure that the person you're interviewing has actually had that experience. So not properly screening is a pitfall. People will often try to come up with something, meaning like come up with a story that fits your question, even if there's nothing really readily at hand for them. And so that's going to result in data that's psychologically thin at best. So that's a screening issue. Um, Similarly, one might fall into an everyday attitude as a first-time researcher. What do I mean by an everyday attitude? As if you're having a conversation with a friend or an acquaintance or even a stranger, but an everyday conversation rather than a research interview, right? So we're trying to learn a research interview in this case, and since to make a big generalization, we are naturally interpretive creatures. So much of communication is implicit and taken for granted that we may jump ahead of where the other person is. We may be full of assumptions that we haven't really examined about what they mean, and so we're jumping ahead of them, or we're sort of telegraphing to them what we think they're about to say, or what they should say, or acting as if we already understand what they have in mind, which is really not good if you're doing phenomenological research. We want to have a fresh and an open attitude and to be following the meaning of the phenomenon for the other person, not for ourselves. So we're not negating our own experience, but we're setting aside the meanings that that phenomenon has. So if I am a parent, if I were a parent, or if I had had a similar experience in meditative practice than the one I'm interviewing about, I need to bracket, meaning I need to temporarily set aside that meaningful experience of mine in order to turn my attention fully to what's present for the other person, which could be quite surprising actually for me, right? So this is what we would call, as phenomenologists, following the other person's intentionality. And we want to foreground their experience and the meanings that are there for them rather than whatever is present for ourselves. Okay. Now, for those who are clinicians or who are counselors in some manner, it may be actually a struggle, depending on your training, to set aside a kind of reflexive validating of the other person's experience. What do I mean? Part of someone's everyday attitude in the world might be, whether they're a clinician or not, they might assume a need to confirm what the other person is saying. By which I don't mean granting the meaningfulness of it, because we're doing that. As phenomenologists, we are coming into the interview, uh, extending the trust, you could say, that the experience the other person is sharing with us is already meaningful for them. And that's why we're here. We're here to listen to that. Granting that meaningfulness, in other words, turning in an empathic way to the other person as they tell their story, is definitely part of phenomenological interviewing. But here's the distinction: that's different from validating the other person's story. It's different from validating that it, quote unquote, really happened the way they're telling. We're abstaining from passing any kind of judgment that way on the factual parts of the story because we're not interested in validating or invalidating. Did all the events in this story happen exactly the way the person in front of us is relating them? That's not what we're after in a phenomenological interview. What we're interested in is what's the meaning in the story for the other person. So if we rush in to validate, we're dropping what, I'm not going to get terribly technical here, but we're dropping what a phenomenologist would call the epoche. We're dropping something we need to keep in place, which is we're withholding ourselves from saying it really was that way or it's really not that way. That's not what we're after. We're after what's the meaning. So we are, in that sense, abstaining from validating in that regard. We're validating, you could say, the meaningfulness by listening attentively and empathically, but that's not the same thing as agreeing with the other person or confirming that it really is the way that it's being described. No, that's how it's present for them. That's what we're listening for. So, is this a mistake to feel some friction or conflict even around setting aside the urge to validate? No, it's an absolutely natural part of adopting a different kind of attitude in in terms of how you listen to another person. So I think a rule of thumb in deeply engaging in any new perspective, and phenomenology is certainly going to be new to virtually everybody, is experiencing some disorientation because you're entering a new attitude. The shift to doing qualitative work, in other words, a qualitative paradigm, can also be radically different for students because they may have never encountered thinking qualitatively before, right? Or listening qualitatively before. So disorientation, a bit of confusion, some that's part of encountering a new way of seeing and no problem there. So not a mistake, but important to reflect on and adapt. So now I'd like to talk about some critical distinctions in interviewing. I want to propose that there's an important difference between three different modes of consciousness. Understanding the difference is really important in terms of how we prompt the person we're interviewing. So the different modes that I want to propose to you are one, in which the person speaks from their experience with the interviewer. So they're speaking from an experience, like from an experience of parenthood, from an experience of meditative experience, from an experience of discovery or realization, from an experience of loss. In other words, the from is meant to signify that the meaningful presence of that experience is there with them while they're telling their story to you. They're with their story, they're in it, and they're speaking from it. In contrast, when somebody adopts an attitude or is prompted to talk about their experience, that subtly, maybe, or maybe not so subtly, is different. So, what I'm pointing toward here is the difference between the what it's like of the experience itself, which is meant the first option here, which is meant to put you as the interviewee fully in contact with the experience as it's present to you in the here and now. That's what we're after, versus sort of taking a step back as the interviewee and talking about the experience, characterizing it, offering opinions about it, much less analyzing it in some regard. That's talking about something. And you can see, even the way I'm, gesturing, that that's a kind of distancing from the experience itself in order to come up with something to say about it. And that's not what we're looking for because it distances. And that distance is we're looking for as close to the living contact with the experience as possible. Even more stark difference is if we ask someone to explain their experience to us, because an explanatory attitude is entirely different from the what's it like from the qualitative question. If we prompt somebody in an explanatory way, please explain to me the experience of fill in the blank. We're going to prompt them to try to step way back from the experience in a sense and abstract something about it that gives us, as the audience, a cause and effect account of why it happened the way it did. So, in essence, we're asking somebody, theorize about your experience for me. And again, that might be interesting. It certainly can be if we're engaged in a sort of a self-consciously interpretive interview or process with another person where we're intending to develop a reflective interpretation about an experience, then we might want to go down that road. Like let's talk about um, the dreams that you had over the last year that were impactful. What do you think they meant? How did they impact your life? Like these are all hermeneutic questions. They're all interpretive questions. Those are great, and there's methods that are specifically tailored to that kind of approach, but this is not one of them. So in this case, it's the what was it like? So just to stick with that example, if we were interviewing about impactful dreams, we would ask for a concrete description of a time when a dream uh, was strongly impactful on the person. What was that like? Right. So we want a story that's full of rich detail that describes the what it's like of that experience. And that's different, this is my point, from explain to me what it meant in a sort of theoretical way, or give me an account of what caused what to happen in that case. And if you want to read a bit more about the distinctions that I'm making, I did lay this out in a 2014 article that I've mentioned there. All right. So to wrap up a bit, um, here's some of the underlying phenomenological theoretical principles that I've been referencing. One is that entering a phenomenological attitude is transitioning to a new and an unfamiliar perspective. And that's going to be true to some degree for absolutely everyone. Um, one of my favorite French phenomenologists, philosophical phenomenologists, actually referred to this process as potentially even an agony because it involves breaking off or separating oneself temporarily from the attitude of everyday life in order to see things differently. So that's a wrenching free from an attitudes that may be so familiar you didn't even realize that those assumptions were present for you. So it's difficult. Learning something new has that stretch, right? And this, likewise, I've referenced the idea that um, inhabiting a phenomenological attitude as a researcher is a different intentionality from everyday life. So it's not an everyday situation when you're interviewing someone. And that implies a shift of consciousness. So when philosophical phenomenology, of which Husserl was the founder, talk about the difference between a natural attitude, meaning the attitude I walk down the street with in everyday life, the difference between that and a phenomenological attitude or a scientific attitude. What part of what's meant there is a shift in consciousness that you undergo intentionally. You choose to go undergo as you shift from one to the other. And we do this all the time, but this raises it to consciousness a bit more, makes it more precise. I did several times mention empathy or an empathic attitude. And my colleague Magnus Englander does really emphasize this nicely in a lot of his publications about phenomenology and empathy as following the meaning for the other person. Um, for empathy, both Churchill and Englander are great sources. Um, And as I mentioned, this does mean entering a phenomenological attitude as an interviewer does mean setting aside temporarily your own natural attitude because you're in a different mode of relating to the other person than you would be if you were having a conversation on the street with a friend. Um, And the natural attitude that one has in everyday life, we normally don't think about as full of assumptions that are implicitly theoretical. Um, and I won't go deeply, and I will withhold myself from going deeply into that issue. It's fascinating and it's an important one. But this is the reason Husserl calls the natural attitude sometimes the natural theoretical attitude, because there's all kinds of implicit assumptions about what's important, how things work, what should matter the most, that are theoretical or quasi theoretical attitudes that we walk around with all the time. And we must suspend those, put them temporarily out of order in order to actually attend to the meanings that are present for the other person. So there you go. If you're interested in more resources, you can check out the blog that I am highlighting here below. And thank you.